You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. We hope you enjoy this part one of a two-part episode with Kevin Sullivan, Ted Bundy expert. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us on Mind Over Murder.
I thank you all for the invitation, and I know it'll be a great time. I look forward to talking about Ted Bundy.
We can't say we're big fans of Ted Bundy, but we are big fans of Kevin Sullivan.
There are fans out there. I don't consider myself a fan, but this is so funny. When I mentioned to one lady talking about Bundy's execution, I said, you have to admit, he deserved it, and I'm glad he was executed. She said, if you're glad he was executed, why do you write about him? I thought, is the qualifier for writing about someone that you have to like them? Let it go. I thought, I'm not going to convince her of anything, but no, I'm not a fan.
I can imagine.
So what actually did prompt your interest?
Well, it's really interesting because I had no intention of writing about Ted Bundy at any time, but I grew up when I went to theological school, and I became an ordained minister when I was a young man and spent many years in it. But at the age of 40, I started writing. I started with one book, and it was a book on George Armstrong Custer as a personality study. And I didn't know I was going to make a career out of writing, but the book did well. And it was a rather small print run, but it did well. And I thought I've gotten the writing thing out of my system. And so I'll just let this go now, but it didn't go anywhere. And since I had started to read about true crime when I was 10 years old, that's the first adult book I ever read. My father had a book called The World's Worst Murders, which came out in 1965. I was 10. And he's an English author, Charles Franklin. My father picked up a copy that same year when it was printed in the United States. So I read that at the age of 10. And I must admit, I was fascinated by it. It took me about 3 weeks to read it. I didn't tell my dad I was reading it. My mother figured it out when I came and asked her over that period of 3 weeks how to pronounce certain words. And so she figured it out. She said she figured it out. I never really commented on it, but she figured it out. From that moment on, I never really went back to kids' books unless I had to at school. I started reading a lot about true crime. I started reading about war. My father was a World War II veteran who survived. His brother was killed in the war. His uncle was killed in the war.
Wow.
So I grew up hearing all those stories. So I read a lot about the war. I just have always been inclined to read about historical things. But at the age of 40, I wanted to write something about George Armstrong Custer, and I did. It was a very short, like 128 page book on the personality of George Armstrong Custer. So in 2005, to answer your question about what got me involved with Ted Bundy, I had a friend here by the name of James Massey, who was in probation and parole here in Louisville, Kentucky for many years. In fact, he retired out of it. He was a good friend with Ron Holmes. Everybody thinks he's a doctor. He's actually a doctor, but it's Ron Holmes, and he's passed on as well. He's a criminologist from Louisville. When Jim and I talked about Bundy, we didn't talk about Bundy a lot. But when we did talk about Bundy, he told me that he was good friends with a man named Jerry Thompson, who was the lead investigator in the Bundy case from Utah. And so I got to know about that. I remember he told me one day, he said, after Bundy was executed, they didn't need that evidence kit that Bundy had. He said it was kept in storage until his execution in Florida. Then Jerry had gotten it to do seminars with as like teaching tools. So I always knew that Jerry had it. I got a call one day from Jim, and he said to me, he said, Jerry Thompson and his wife Jean are coming to Louisville. We're going to meet and have dinner, and they're going to be in town for a few days. Would you like to have dinner with us? So I said, just let me know when all this will transpire. So on the day they arrived, which was a Sunday afternoon, he gave me a call, and he said, meet us at such and such restaurant at 6 or whatever. I said, great. And just as I was about to hang up the phone, he said he brought the bag. And I said, what bag? He said, the bag Ted Bundy carried with all his implements of murder in there. He said, I've got it with me right now in my truck. I said, really? I said, would you mind meeting me a little bit earlier than 6 so I could look at this stuff? He said, sure. So he came up there and he showed me this murder kit. Bundy carried all this stuff in a brown satchel, and it had a ski mask in it. It had an electrical cord, which he was used quite often for strangulation. He had rope for binding people. He had taken a white sheet and he torn it into lengths, and he would use those for binding hands and feet. He had a ice pick. They're not too sure what he would do with the ice pick, but they do believe they found one victim that had a puncture wound in the abdomen. And then he had 2 right-handed gloves. The left is missing. Bundy was left-handed, but there's only 2 right-handed gloves in the murder kit. So it may be that, and he used these for dragging bodies in the winter. Bundy, when he would dump a body, he would not go that far off the trail, but he could be 1,000 feet or something. He would use these to drag the body. I don't know where the left-handed gloves were, but one was a ski puffy type glove, like black or really dark blue. The other was a woolen glove with a leather palm with it. He also had Glad bags that he used. He would always use those to discard the clothing of his victims. If he left a body on top of the ground, he would never leave it with more than a beaded necklace. But he would take all the clothes and anything. Of course, that's before DNA.
Right.
But he took everything that could possibly be contaminated with hairs or any kind, his or hers or any evidence. He would take those and he would dump those maybe 100 miles down in a dumpster. I know for a fact that with the Julie Cunningham murder in Colorado, he said that he took it way down the road, but he dumped that into a Goodwill dumpster. So somebody got Julie's clothes and then whatever thing else she had on there, and nobody ever knew this. So he had all these various items, a flashlight, of course, for working at night. So I got to look at it, and we met Jerry and Gene Thompson, and we went ahead and had a great dinner. Then we went back to the Breckenridge Inn here in Louisville. It just was torn down like last month, but it's in what's called the Hikes Point area. It's a nice area. We sat around the pool, and the 3 of us talked, and I got to interview Jerry for the first time. At the time, I was writing I wasn't on staff. I would submit feature articles, main articles, to a weekly print newspaper in Louisville. It was published in Louisville, Lexington, Kentucky, and 5 other states. So I thought I might write an article about interviewing Jerry and just seeing this murder kit. So we had a great time. And as I say, they turned the bag over to Jim for several days that they were here. I called Jim either the next night or the following night. I said, hey, would you mind if I brought Ted's murder kit over to my house? I'd like to take some photographs. He said, sure. So I went over to his house. I picked it up, put it on the passenger seat. I'm driving. It's already nighttime. I called my wife. I said, listen, honey, I said, if there's anything on the dining room table, could you go ahead and remove it? Because I'm bringing Ted Bundy's murder kit into the house. She wasn't so pleased about that.
I was going to say, how did she respond?
It's not like, this is not her dream night.
No.
I said, honey, I'm bringing Ted Bundy's murder kit.
Yeah, I could see a lot of people not reacting.
No, but she understood. So I brought this thing in. I photographed it. My son-in-law was here. We photographed it. And I took the bag back. When they were leaving, like the day after, Jim called me and said, come back to the Breckenridge Inn and talk to Jerry and Gene for a little bit. And he said he would like to see you. I said, sure. So we came back up there, and here's what did it. As we're standing there talking, he gave me and he gave Jim one of the Glad trash bags from Bundy's murder kit. It was a kit that it held 10 at one point. And when they arrested him, it had 7 in it. And so he gave me one, he gave Jim one. And I said, Jerry, would you mind writing a letter of authentication for this? And I didn't have any paper or pens with me. So he said, yeah. So I ran into the Breckenridge Inn and I got some of their stuff with their heading on it of the Breckenridge Inn. And he wrote it out. I take this thing home. I write the article for Snitch and I thought I'll be done with it. But listen, this experience for me was so surreal. I would read a little bit about Bundy. I'd look at that bag. I think this is actually from Ted Bundy's car.
Yeah.
And it wasn't meeting Jerry. It was having that murder kit in my home and having that bag given to me that I said to myself, I'm going to write a biography of Bundy. And I was aware that most of the books that have been written, the standard books from these authors that worked with him and stuff like that, they were published years ago. Of course, I didn't know Bundy. So I decided to write this book, and I never interviewed him, but I thought, you know what? I've got the testimony of Jerry. I bet I can hunt down all the other detectives. And then Jim said to me, he said, I can put you in touch with Dr. Al Carlisle. from Utah who did the psychological examination of Bundy. And of course, you've got an open door now with Jerry. He said, I know Mike Fisher, the Colorado investigator. He said, but I don't have any contact information. But if you find him, tell him that you know me and say hello for me. And I said I would. There was others that I had to track down. Bill Hagmeyer, the FBI agent who worked with Bundy for the last few years of Bundy's life. And Bill was very gracious to me. We had a really long interview one day by phone, and then I called him back again and he answered additional questions. So I was able to track everybody down that I needed to. I got all these case files from all these different locations. I remember even Jim said, he said, now, Kevin, you say you want to write this biography, but Bundy's been done to death. You should think writing about someone else. I said, no. And sometimes, and I say this to people, you just got to go with what you know inside. This was so cool because even though people were telling me, no, there's enough books on Bundy, nothing had been written on him many years. I said, I'm going to do it. And I was glad I did because halfway through the book, which came to be The Bundy Murders, A Comprehensive History, which is my flagship book on Bundy. It's a full treatment of the murders and a full biography of Bundy. When I was about halfway through with that book, I was discovering new things that no one had discovered about several of the murders and from these detectives, and a lot of very new information about the case in general. I have a friend who, after the book came out in 2009, he was having lunch with Stephen Michaud, the writer of The Only Living Witness and Conversations with a Killer. They were discussing my book, and my friend had my book with him, and he picked up my book. Michaud did it. He said, listen, there are things in this book that even I didn't know. He worked with Bundy, and he said, and this is what Michaud said. I didn't talk to Michaud about this, but my friend said, and he said, this goes to show how, like, determined investigation, if you just keep at something, you're going to plow new ground. And that's exactly what happened. So I was able, once I finished that book in 2008, it was a 2.5-year marathon, 7 days a week. It was mornings and nights, and I'd be out with my wife, and the detective from another state would call, and I'd take the call. And she gave up a lot of time with me to do that. I told her I'll never write a book quite like that and take that much time away from you again. But it was a real 2.5-year marathon. She's very pleased with it now because it's always done so well. That was the first book.
I wanted to jump in here with a question, Kevin, because even just in you starting to lay the groundwork for your first Bundy book, some of the key players have already passed on. Were you running tape? Were you recording these interviews as you met all of these people that were providing this additional information, much of which had never been made public before? How were you doing it more in a traditional journalist style where you were just taking notes?
There were times when I did take notes only. There were times when I interviewed. The interviews that I did were interviews I did face to face. In fact, in the Enigma of Ted Bundy, I published the interview quite lengthy with Ron Holmes. I got a really good interview from Don Patchen back in 2008 because I wrote the Bundy murders sequentially. I started in Washington State and then wrote about Utah. I already had Jerry's interview, and then I went on to Florida. But yes, and I got Jerry Thompson, who passed away. I interviewed Jerry for the second time at the Fashion Place Mall where Bundy had abducted Carol DeRanch. We sat in the cafeteria, I should say the food court. That was back in August of 2006. So I originally interviewed Jerry in 2005, and then in 2006, when I knew I was going to write the book, we did another more in-depth interview. I talked to Jerry a lot on the phone, so sometimes I was just taking notes. And in the case of Mike Fisher, Fisher supplied me with a lot of really good backstory information that I couldn't get. And I remember he described a particular murder. Actually, he was describing the murder and what Bundy did to Karen Campbell. He didn't identify it. He said, is there any way? He said, I'll tell you the story of how one murder unfolded as Bundy told it to me. But he said, is there any way, because he wants to protect the remainder of the family. And he said, is there any way that you can't put this person's name to it? I said, Mike, from what you've described, I can tell you that's Julie Cunningham. And he said, yeah, that's correct. I said, my publisher probably wouldn't like that. So he gave me the okay on that. Fisher was very guarded about certain things about the murders when Bundy was first executed, and even in the years since. And I think in the years following, and this is again 20 years, Bundy was put to death in 89. This is 2008 when I'm interviewing him, or 2007, I should say, and into 2008. So we're talking 18, 19 years after the execution of Bundy. He came clean well, not came clean, I hate to use that term, but he was more willing to tell some things that never got into print before. I was very fortunate. And Mike did a wonderful thing because many things, we talked a lot on the phone, but he wrote out for me many of his experiences and emailed them. You'll see those, most of those show up in their full format in my second book, which is called The Trail of Ted Bundy. So sometimes it was interviewing by tape, sometimes it was just taking notes, and sometimes it was just, if I'm in the car talking to Jerry Thompson, I'm listening to him and I'm running home and then writing it down. However, when before the Bundy Murders was published, any quotes that I used from any detectives in the book, The Bundy Murders, McFarland has a thing where they must have those quotes sent to the people that were interviewed. In this case, it would be mostly detectives, but others, certain people that I interviewed, like Dr. Al Carlisle and things like that, who weren't actually in the police force. I would say, this is what I've got you telling me in the book. If I'm wrong about anything, tell me, I'll fix it and send it back to you. So only in one case did somebody say, you got something wrong and here's what it is, I fixed it. Then they'd sign off on it. And they had to send me, back then, they had to send me an actual paper with their signature, and I would mail those to McFarland. So they just wanted to make sure that I had all my I's dotted and T's crossed. I only sent this off to 6 publishers in October of 2009 after they finished the book. I heard back from McFarland very quickly, and I asked the acquisition editor what it was that he liked about my book that he responded so quickly. He said, you've got everything, like footnoted, you've got everything, it's right there for us to look up. And he said, I like your prose, but I like it's an in-depth. And I did that on purpose. I crammed so much into the Bundy Murders. That was my intention. I've had people come back and tell, I've had to read your book 2 and 3 times just to take it all in.
Yeah, I've read it a couple of times.
I'm telling you, that's what people tell me. And of course, it's an audio book now. And this one lady was so funny. She said, when she left a really nice review on all of it, she said, this book, it makes me look forward to getting stuck in traffic. Nobody likes to be stuck in traffic, but it gives her an opportunity to listen to the book longer. So it really was a case of doing what I knew I should do and write this book. My thought was, if I can just produce a book that will be considered mainstream and maybe enter, quote, like the Bundy canon, unquote, I'll be happy. I had no idea when I started the book I was going to be finding so much new revelatory ground that would come to the surface, especially about some of the murders. It was just shocking, but in a good way. I've had someone tell me who's familiar in publishing, he said, Kevin, that book's going to be going long after you're dead. He said, they'll probably be publishing that book 100 years from now. Maybe not, who knows about those things, but it was a nice thing to say. People do the fact, and I also wrote it a different way. I wrote it as if you're like riding along with Bundy. You're there seeing the things in real time. Before, when dealing with Bundy, a lot of times writers would have the girls disappearing, nobody knows who they are. And I do that in one chapter, but in the rest of it, you are just following along as these things are unfolding. And people have commented a lot about that. And McFarland in 2020, they did a second edition, an updated one, and I added new information to it. I had so many comments about the way I had written it, where people feel like it's all happening in real time, that I knew I made the right decision to do that. So anyway, but things just worked out very well for that book, and I'm very grateful.
What do you make of the fact that there was always new information coming forward? How did that manifest itself? Did people just keep reaching out to you or saying you should also talk to? How did that work?
Yes, it's an interesting thing. After the Bundy Murders was published, when I wrote that book, I always stick to the facts, but I remember there was a couple things I said about the murder of Kathy Parks and a letter that she probably mailed that night. She ran into a woman named Lorraine Fargo, and I said, it could be because Lorraine came from the library, and I know how Bundy, he likes to hunt libraries. I said, I wonder if he was following Lorraine that night. And then he saw Lorraine Fargo stop and talk. And I say this in the book, stop and talk with Kathy Parks. It was speculation, but it was based on some of the letter she wrote to her boyfriend was postmarked May 7th, 1974. And she disappeared on May 6th, just before midnight. So I suspect that she might have had that letter with her at that time. Anyway, A year later, Lorraine Fargo contacts me and we became friends. And she told me about all the damage, the emotional damage he's carried all these years Bundy had done to a friend. And that happens a lot with people. But I asked her a couple of questions. I asked her about these and she confirmed both of them. She said, yeah, Kathy, I was watching her. We talked right across from a small street that separates the Memorial Union Commons cafeteria where she went into and ran into Bundy a little before 11. So we were just across the street. And as we talked, I saw the letter in her hand. And turns out she had a weird guy bothering her at the library who followed her out, which I think is no doubt Bundy. She tried not to look him in the face. She got some looks at him, but she said she just trying to get away from this guy. And so she fell in with a crowd. So he probably kept his distance and then saw her talking with Kathy. And then Kathy comes back into the cafeteria and Bundy goes back in. So think of this. I've had so many people contact me. And honestly, there's 3 categories this falls into. One, people contact me and they think they've had an encounter with Bundy, but maybe geographically it doesn't work out. He just wasn't there at the time. There's one lady here in Louisville that is convinced that Bundy, and there's a little town across the river from Louisville called New Albany. There's Jeffersonville and New Albany, Indiana, just across the river. She thinks Bundy was attacking her here in 1974. It's not true. Bundy was in the Northwest. He was up in Washington State doing all those murders. So he wasn't here. But then you get these other things where you can get these stories to where you think, boy, that really looks good, or it doesn't look so good based on what they said. And then you have some people come along and they tell you things, and man, it's Bundy. It's Bundy from what they say he said to her. And so it's just real interesting. And I've had so many people, I couldn't even tell you how many people have contacted me over the years, but I wasn't kidding when I'm saying that they helped drive the additional books, because these interviews I would do, they would build up in my files. And then, okay, so then I published a second book and I thought this is going to be it. I've got all these people in there, all this new information. Certainly that's going to be it. And then more people would come out and they would talk to me. And this was very cool.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
I interviewed a woman for my second book, The Trail of Ted Bundy, who was the blonde. I don't know if you've ever seen the picture, but she's pretending to wash dishes with Ted Bundy. That is Carol Bartholomew. She was Carol Hall at the time. She married Wayne Bartholomew, who became an attorney. They had a bunch of kids and grandkids, but she's the one that was with Bundy that night at this party where they were all together. She gave me the name of a woman named Louise Cannon, who was also, and I can't wait to tell you this story. Louise Cannon, I said, have you ever been contacted by a writer? She said, no. She said, outside of the detectives I've spoken to, no one's ever contacted me. Here was Louise Cannon's deal. And she knows Carol Bartholomew. Louise Cannon used to work at a bank that her family owned right near where Bundy lived, not at 565 First Avenue in Salt Lake City, but when he had to move after he was on the cops' radar and he lost his VW, he moved a little bit closer even to where he needed to be. So her bank was like what they call caddy corner and 2 blocks away, and he would see her in this bank. Louise was not a woman Louise was one of these women he wanted to date. And Bundy had those he wanted to date and those he wanted to murder. So he would talk to her, and they even went and had coffee one night. And when it snowed, he would come over. Sometimes she'd work when everybody else left and the bank was locked up. She still was going to be in the drive-through lanes where people drive up and stuff, and they go put their little tubes in or whatever. And so she would work there. And Bundy, he came over and cleaned off the snow, and he just wanted to get to know her. Here's what was so cool about this. This is amazing. I never thought I would be able to find this out. She said, but I want to tell you a story of what happened. On October 18th, she said, I came into a bar called the Widow McCoy's. And they still have a Widow McCoy's in Salt Lake City, but it's a couple blocks down from the original. She said, I came in there and I saw Ted sitting at the bar by himself, and he was drinking, and he looked very sullen. And she said, hi, Ted. He said, hi, Louise. Now, she said at any other time he would want to be chatting me up, but he wasn't that way now. He just wanted to be by himself. They exchanged words a little bit. And then she walked onto her table and she sat down with her girlfriends and they were all just talking. She said, the next time I looked over the bar, he was gone. And the significance of October 18th is this was around 8 or 8:30. I'll have to check my book. It's around 8 or 8:30 at night. The same night at around 10, he kidnapped very close to there, Melissa Smith. That is the daughter of Chief Lewis, one of those little cities in the greater Salt Lake area, made up of all these other little cities. He was the chief of police of Midvale, Utah.
Oh, wow.
And Bundy likely got her going home. But here's the thing about Bundy later admitted that he would very often start, if he knew if a murder was more or less planned or he knew he was going to go out hunting, he would use alcohol as a type of an elixir to jumpstart him, to get into that altered state. Now, this makes perfect sense while Louise and I told her this. I said, Louise, the reason why he didn't want to talk much, he was already entering that altered state and he was jump-starting himself with alcohol. He was thinking about the woman he was going to get. He was thinking about what he wanted to do with her. And all of this came out for the first time. And again, this is a woman that had never been talked to by any writers or any news people, only detectives. And if it wouldn't have been for Carol giving me her name, because that's one lady that didn't contact me, but I just learned it from Carol. And sometimes these contacts happen just like that, a lot of times. But a lot of them contact me, and that's how this stuff starts to formulate. Let me just say this right here. After the 6th book, I stomped my foot on the ground and I said, that's it, I'm done. And then lo and behold, 2 out of 3 people that contacted me in January of last year, just a year ago, turned out to be absolute valid Bundy people. I told my publisher, I said, and I waited, and then more came in. And I told my publishers, I said, you know what? I'm thinking of doing a yearly update, having a book that's really 250 to 300 pages instead of that. I think I'll put out a yearly update on these new cases that are coming, and I only use the ones that I'm quite sure are cases. I said, I think I'll just put out, maybe it's going to be 150 pages, but I'll do it once a year. And then if it peters out in 2 or 3 years, then that'll be the end of it. At least those new testimonies that come in that I think are valid, I'd like to get them out there. Then I will add stuff to it and we'll look at other aspects of the case and maybe delve into some other things. But it's funny because as I feel about myself, I'm a historian, and the more stuff I can get on the printed page, the better it is. I've got some things coming out with this. In fact, it's going to be called Ted Bundy, the Yearly Updates, Volume 1. The publisher has Volume 1 now. Pretty soon it'll be in the editing phase. Yeah, and so that should be coming out later in 22. So much stuff came to me during this last year, I just had to do it. So if that continues, I will continue having the Yearly Updates, Volume 2, Volume 3, etc.
So how do you determine the difference between someone who has had a genuine, valid Bundy run-in with someone who's just reaching out for attention? Because I'm sure you do get those too. There's
a couple ways of doing it. If things work out geographically and you can find out some things and you think that they were there in a certain part of the country when Bundy was there, then you automatically have to say that's a possibility. Now, sometimes certain things come out, and I've got something coming out in this book where Bundy, this 7th book, this yearly update, for example, I think this is an example. There were 2 women who had an apartment. The publisher doesn't want me to go into great detail about these things right now because they hadn't been published, but they lived on a 1st floor apartment in Salt Lake City in a brownstone, and they got a knock on the door one day. This fellow that they later identified, both of them, as Ted Bundy, he said, I am looking for, he said, excuse me. Bundy was always polite. He was always saying, excuse me, miss, or excuse me, ma'am, or could I bother you for a second? Or I'm sorry to bother you. Very polite. And this guy came there and he said, I'm sorry to bother you, but there's a woman that lives in your building. I don't know where she lives. And he described her. And they said, yeah, we know who that is, but we don't remember her name. He said, I'm a law student at the University of Utah. This was in the first month after he was there. He said, I've got her notes and I'm going to give them back to her. She said, why don't you give them to me and I'll give them to her when I see her. And he said, no, we'll be in class tomorrow. I will give them to her there. And they said, thank you. And he left. Well, that's got Bundy all over it. And they both identified him. So I consider that absolute valid contact. Here's something else I look for. When somebody contacts me with a grandiose story, a red flag will go up until I can very much determine whether they are a valid contact or not. I won't say who this is, but I had one person who lived in the geographic area and who said all the right things. And then when it came down to walking to Bundy's car, this person identified that Bundy had a boat on his car, like at Lake Sammamish. He didn't. He used that story, but he never did bring a boat with him or a little canoe or whatever. He didn't do it. And so you'll hear things out of these stories and these red flags will pop up. There are times when I'll say, I can't prove this, but this has all earmarks or whatever of it being a true story. But there's others I can say, yes, that this is really an absolute. And then there's some I can say, yes, this is likely Bundy. And then there's others of the people that contact me, probably less than 10% are valid. That's how many. Yeah. Now there's a couple people. I talk about one woman in this book. She said, I didn't have much of an encounter with Bundy. I wrote the Bundy story so many years ago, the Bundy murders. I had forgotten that Bundy had admitted to killing two in Oregon. She contacted me and she had a story for me. And she said, I had an encounter with him. It wasn't much, she said, but later when he was arrested, I was able to identify that's the person. He drove a beige Volkswagen Beetle. He nearly ran into me. He was driving very slowly through Oregon State University, same place where Kathy Parks went out. Now, because it wasn't in 74, I told her, and if you read the seventh book, you'll see this. I was kicking myself later when I discovered there was a second one in that state. I said, it really couldn't have been Bundy because he was there in 74. And plus, I'm thinking there wasn't anybody else. And so it may be, but chances are it's not. So I said, no. But he did kill a second in that state, in Oregon. And he got his VW in 73. I can't remember if she told me if it was 73 or 75, but either would fit. Here's what she said. She said, this is all that happened. I've got like some papers in my hand or something. He's driving slow and I'm not looking as well as I should. I step out almost in front of him and he stops. He nearly hit me, but it was really almost her fault. But then he rolled down the window and he asked her if he could take her for a ride or something like that. She thought he was very nice looking. She thought he was very polite, but she said no. Now, what do I think of that now? Because I realized that it could be Bundy. I wish I would have kept her story, but I didn't. Of course, after that event years ago, I never let another one go. And so I've kept all these things in my files. But that's how you can. So in her case, I would say it seems rather likely because she did say that she identified. I had one person tell me once, she said, as I was talking to him, and this is what is really funny. Bundy, funny as in odd, not haha. Bundy had kidnapped Lynette Culver from Pocatello, Idaho. It was actually the anniversary date of the Kathy Parks murder 1 year later. So Culver went out on May 6, 1975. He actually arrived in Pocatello on May 5th, but due to a number of things, he couldn't get any women to follow him. One thing I found out that no other author has written about, one of the reasons why I determined he had such problems obtaining victims on that May 5th when he got to Pocatello, Idaho, is because they were still having snow showers on that day, and it was very cold. So any woman going back and forth with her car, she's not really going to pay a lot of attention. They're going to want to stop and talk.
Sure.
And it was the next day, and it was a better day, that he was able to get Lynette Culver. This woman that contacted me, she said, I live very close to where that was. I can't remember the date. I can't even be sure of the year, if it was 74 or 75. Now, this is very common with people. If you look back on your own life, there are things that happened to me from when I was a kid even with great clarity, but I can't always remember the year. You just can't remember. But she said, I live close to there. Now, this guy that pulled up to me, he wasn't. And if she wanted to lie, she could have said he was driving a VW. Sure. She said he wasn't driving a VW. Here's something she didn't know. Bundy would borrow cars a lot. He also had a truck, but this was a car. She said he called me up and he said he wanted to interview me. I was walking home, and this was very close to where this other abduction happened, and it could be in the future or it could have been after she went out. He said he wanted to interview her, and she said, I got within about 5 feet of the car. Then I moved, I think she said she moved a little closer. She said, I remember what he looked like, and I remembered what his voice sounded like. She said, my father told me when I was a young girl to remember what people sound like and what they look like should anything ever happen. Just remember what even their voice sounds like. She said, so I was listening very carefully to how he spoke and what he said. But then she said, as he was interviewing me about some matter, I don't even know what that was. She said she looked down and the record button on the little recorder had not been pressed.
Oh, wow.
And that bothered her. So then she went off. So was it Bundy? We have no way of knowing. Is it a possibility it could be Bundy? Yes. Here's why. Bundy was a creature of habit. He would often hunt the same area. He would travel. He would occasionally not only stop in the same city, but sometimes at the same gas station where he had stopped before. So he used to love to stay whenever possible at Holiday Inns. And so he was a creature of habit. So we can't say this isn't as strong as a lot of these other things I've published. But there's enough there that makes me think it could very well have been Bundy. And especially because the story wasn't that much to it. And she said, this is all I can tell you. But and when he was finally arrested, she told her parents, that's the guy. Because I recognize his voice and I recognize his face. That's how I tried to determine, could somebody snooker me on one? It's possible. But at the same time, I may have lost some valid testimonies by ruling people out because of other things. I try to err on the side of always getting it right. What's really great is that some of these stories, which other people know the people that I'm talking to, and they have these fabulous stories to tell, you think that they're absolutely genuine. It just really helps people. And just think about all the people that will read about. Bundy's not going anywhere. Bundy's become America's Jack the Ripper.
Yeah.
He's not going anywhere. And I think 100 years from now, people will be reading about Bundy. But see, since I've been writing books about Ted, a lot of people have passed away. The investigators, Lorraine Fargo's gone, but I've gotten all this testimony from Lorraine. And so for the historians and for the people later, it's great to get this stuff down in print. And on those times when we can't absolutely prove it, the only thing that goes in my book is that it either is or it's likely. So it's good to put it out there. So I always try to get the accurate testimonies from people and only publish those that I have good faith in.
Kevin, now that you've been studying Bundy for so many years, what's your theory about how did he get away with killing so many people over such a long period of time? What was it about his approach that allowed him, succeeds not exactly the word I'm looking for here, but to offend over and over again and still literally get away with it?
You're absolutely right. And that's one of the things that fascinates people about the Bundy murder. One aspect is, of course, he was a college graduate and a law student and all that, and that he looked so normal from the outside. But it is stunning to most people that he got away with murder for so long. I think that is due to a couple of things. I think it's due to most of his murders were planned. When I say planned, I don't mean that he knew always exactly who he was going to get, but he would set up the pattern of how he would hunt and try to get people. And he said, you always want to make sure that you're not seen by other people putting someone in your car. He wasn't so concerned about walking down the street with somebody or somebody rendering aid to him, but he didn't want to be seen putting somebody actually into his vehicle. And for example, at Central Washington State College, he parked in a no parking zone by a railroad track right behind, about 150 feet behind the library. Of course, he loved hunting libraries, and it had some tall grass there. And that's why, and it wasn't well lighted. That's why I say in the Bundy murders, it's a great place to commit a murder or at least begin one. He was always thinking this way. When he was hunting for a victim at the Wildwood Inn and he was outside in the pool area, because they had this outdoor pool and it's a 3-sided hotel and everything faces the pool except for those on the other side. He was already familiar with the deep steam that came off the pool, and it would shroud people and you couldn't see them, and then it would clear and you could see them. And then it would shroud them again. And sometimes you'd hear voices, but you couldn't see through the steam. So he was always looking for the angle of being able to abduct and not be seen. And uncanny, people that don't really know the story, the first thing they hear is that these girls vanish. They sometimes vanish within just a short distance. You get deeper into the story, you can see how he did it. He was also an opportunist, but even there, it was usually picking up a hitchhiker, or it was being with somebody that he could possibly murder because they were walking alone. And if he felt that initial drive to murder when he was near somebody and was rising up, chances are, unless he thought he was going to be caught, he would go for it. But if you look at when he started, he killed before 1974, but it was sporadic. Maybe 1, 2, maybe 3 people, not a lot. When he launched himself into full-time murder, January of 1974, he knew he was never coming back. He was just going to do it full-time, and everything else he did with politics or whatever, which started to quickly fade away, or schooling or law school, it was just to be a facade while he committed murder. And he got away with all through 1974, all the way into Utah when he went in September, and he kicked up the killing and killed at least 4 women in just a matter of weeks. Then when he started killing in 1975, and the reason why I'm going through this little thing now, it wasn't until he got to Pocatello in May of 1975 that anybody even asked him a question about what he was doing in a certain area. He'd gone up into a women's dormitory where males were not allowed. A male security officer or somebody on staff said, "You're not supposed to be here. Do you have any identification on you?" He said, "No." He said, "You got to leave the building." And so out Bundy, that's the first time he had ever had anything thrown up into his face about the murder. He was very careful. Dr. Al Carlisle said, this is a man that when dealing with conversations with people, if he knew he had to talk to you, he would anticipate what you're going to say, what you might ask. And Carlisle said he might have 2 or 3 different answers to give you that would best fit at the moment. That would be a tough way for me to live if I had to pre-screen all of my conversations and figure that out. But he was this way. He was a very internal person. All this thing was internalized. Bob Keppel said it. He was correct. The Washington detective. I knew Bob, great guy. He's another one that's gone now. But Keppel said, this is a guy that thinks about murder 24/7. And that's true. And when Bundy passed that, from that realm from fantasy to reality, he just lived in this world of murder the whole time. Everything else he did as a normal human was just to keep the charade going, that he was a normal person. I don't think there's ever going to be anybody. There's a lot of people that have killed more than Bundy. But I don't think and Bundy really, God knows how many he killed. Have you all seen the movie? And I interviewed Bill Hagmaier twice, but there's certain things that came out in the movie. Yeah. If you see that, Bundy talks about he's whacked some of these girls in the head, dragged them, and they would wake up and run off into the woods. Yeah, I recently watched that. Hagmaier pressed him. Oh, that's a great movie, isn't it? It's a very good movie. That guy's got Bundy's mannerisms down. It's great. But if you notice, they worked with Bill closely. And everything that you're hearing in that, Bill told them. And here's when Hagmaier was really pressing Bundy at the end, how many did you kill? He said, that again? But he kept pressing him. He said, I don't know. He said, it all gets confusing. I was on the phone one day with Bill, and he said, and Bill knew, I'm assuming Bill checked up on me. He knew I was an ordained minister. So we were talking about God. He said, Bundy asked me one day, what am I going to say again? That's the $64,000 question. What are you going to say, Ted? But it was bothering him. He had been an agnostic most of his life, but he wasn't so much so at the end. And then he admitted that at the end that he did believe there was a God, but he was worried about what he was going to say to him. He should have been. And it was interesting. Yeah, that's the thing about Bundy. Psychopaths are this way. Yeah. They only think of themselves. It's just about murder. Thank God people like Bundy that can get away with murder like that for so long. It's a rare breed. What you heard what Bundy said, and I already knew this, if you can watch the movie, he talked about the little fish that get caught, the murderers, and then they go a little bit deeper down. But he then said, you go all the way to the bottom, there's where the big fish are. They watch everything. And that's what he did. He watched everything. He was so internalized. And nobody had any idea that he was a monster. This is why so many people that knew Bundy could not bring themselves to believe that he could be the murderer of the Northwest and beyond. Fascinating case.
Join us again next time as we continue our conversation with Ted Bundy expert Kevin Sullivan. That's next time on Mind Over Murder.
Thank you so much for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.